So here we are. Okay, so a motivating question. Identity politics has recently superseded interest-based politics in many countries, okay, including Russia, Turkey, India, United States. So how might certain types of actors facilitate this transition? So here's a core statement. Certain institutional entrepreneurs, and these are agents who devote resources to altering or shaping institutions, utilize identity politics to advance their political, material, or social goals. All right. They use narratives, actions, and symbols to shape political, economic, and normative understandings and prescriptions, reactions, the related perceptions of social identity. Okay. In particular, they're going to promote singular rather than plural identities. In so doing, they generate social cleavages that underlie and reinforce identity politics. So that's the key idea. Origins. This is really part of chapter 4 of the current manuscript that I'm working on for Cambridge Press. Developmental dilemmas, the role of power and agency, kind of a continuation of a project I've been doing for the last 10, 15 years that relates collective action problems to institutions and development, inequality, and so forth. Okay. So outline of this talk. Okay, first what I want to do is give a little bit of discussion of the background of institutional entrepreneurs, who they are, what they do, and then talk about a key domain of influence, institutions and ideologies. Then I can conceive of these as shared mental models. So I need to explain that. Then I'll talk a little bit more about entrepreneurial activity, and what they're going to do is combine elements of leadership and brokerage, and they're going to operate in sort of two basic broad domains, one being economic, political, and the other being normative and identity, and the two domains can interact with each other, and usually do, actually. So I'm going to focus mostly on the normative identity, however. So they can influence social norms, both existing norms and the evolution or the development of new norms, or dissolution of old norms. And they can also influence both individual and group social identities. Okay, and these interactions generate externalities. They're going to be associations with affiliation groups, and there's going to be an underlying element of resource conflict that's going to enter into all of this stuff. And a key element that I'll get to toward the end of the talk is the distinction between plural identities and singular identities, and how that relates to identity politics. And then we'll give conclusion. So institutional entrepreneurs. Okay, these are agents, again, who devote resources to altering institutions in some fashion, or transforming them, or undermining them, destroying them. And this is both informal and formal institutions. They may alter interpretations of prescriptions. They may work on underlying beliefs, conceptual frameworks, reactions. They're going to use narratives, actions, symbols, and the transmission of these things may follow somewhat of an evolutionary dynamic, which I'm not going to try to model here. Okay. They can operate anywhere between micro and macro levels. So an institutional entrepreneur might be a bureaucrat in the middle of some corporate bureaucracy, or maybe a national level politician, or maybe a big media figure or something like that, right? Characteristics, they tend to have some set of social skills. They tend to recognize certain types of problems, alert to certain kinds of opportunities, and they're willing to take risks like any type of entrepreneur. And then their targets, again, are going to be concepts, rules, ideologies, institutions, which I'm going to think of as shared mental models. So I'll give a little bit of background on that. So what do I mean by mental models? Well, mental models are the way that boundedly rational people or agents navigate their social terrain, essentially. And so I'm going to argue that people have bounded rationality. In other words, we have cost. It's costly to exercise cognition. It takes time and sometimes effort, which is sometimes kind of painful. And our cognition is quite limited. Sometimes we only have really dim understandings of our social environments. Okay, and there's certain problems that are just way too complicated for us to figure out. Okay, so within that, we desire and we need cognitive shortcuts. We need ways to make things simpler, to break them down so that we can manage them. And to do this, we're going to borrow from others, and this will be subject to all kinds of influence. Mental models are a way of thinking about this. So what mental models are is they're conceptual frameworks that include categories. These can be social categories, right? Age, gender, race, occupation, so on and so forth, right? And causal relationships, simple causal relationship. And if I insult someone to their face, I'm likely to get a bad reaction. Okay, that would be a simple mental model, right? So these mental models can be shared, transmitted via stories, narratives, and actions. Okay, and two really important types of mental models are ideologies and institutions, which again are transmitted via narratives and often follow somewhat of an evolutionary dynamic. Okay, so ideologies. What are these? They're visions of society with some sort of ethical content. They tend to include some set of goods or evils from the past, maybe glorious heritage, maybe horrendous exploitation, whatever, right? Myths, history. They'll point to evils, problems, or threats that exist in the present. They will talk about the possibility of a brighter future and required action necessary, maybe in very vague terms, necessary for a brighter future. There'll be some sort of broad ethical prescription, and they can justify various types of inequality, right? And this would be, again, a role of entree for institutional entrepreneurs, or to justify inequality that favors them, for example. Okay, so they're mental models. They're categories and they're causal relationships. So for example, a libertarian ideology would have categories of private firms and government. Okay, causal relationship, government regulation interferes with innovation, thereby reducing economic growth and generating bad results for society as a whole. And an ethical prescription, pretty vague, right? And therefore, good citizens should try to promote enterprise and oppose government regulation or something along those lines. And we could construct a similar set of categories and prescriptions for Marxist ideology or for any other set of ideologies. There are many out there, right? And what do ideologies do? They motivate collective action. They motivate formation of coalitions, which can promote change. Therefore, they're fertile territory for institutional entrepreneurs to try to act on. Institutions, the real target, right, of institutional entrepreneurship. How do we define them? Well, I'll define them the way North does, rules of the game in a society, okay? Or another way of putting it is they're mutually understood behavioral prescriptions of some sort, okay? You should do this, you should not do this, you can do this, you cannot do that, that sort of thing. They can be informal, conventions and social norms, or they can be formal, laws, regulations. Okay, what do? They really have three functions here. One, they motivate certain types of action. They can do this by providing incentives or shaping preferences. So for example, a tax on cigarettes may in fact reduce smoking, okay, via an incentive. They convey information. Who gets what kind of information? Who in a corporation gets to see the full treasurer's report, for example? That would be set by an institutional rule. And most important for this talk, they shape cognitions. In other words, institutions, they're shared mental models. They're shared sets of categories and causal relationships that help us navigate social terrain. Okay, so who can, cannot, should not, do what, when, how? So a simple example, a social norm, do not cut in line. Okay, I approach a theater. There are 100 people standing there in line. I don't know any of them. How do I interact with these strangers? I go to the end of the line. Easy. Okay, so the conceptual framework of the shared mental model helps me to interpret that environment that might otherwise be quite difficult. All right. So now, what do institutional entrepreneurs do? Well, broadly speaking, they utilize power to alter institutions. In other words, we can say that agency combined with power shapes institutional evolution, which then shapes the context within which agency interacts and so on and so forth. All right. So they're going to alter incentives, information flows, understandings. Why? Well, because they can, and they have some reason for wanting to do so. Okay, and some of them are going to utilize identity politics, right? Focus of this talk. So their ability to do so is going to depend on access to sources and distribution of power. Okay, entrepreneurship can be especially influential in areas with contestation, borderlands, areas that just went through big conflict, areas subject to institutional transformations. This sort of thing. Okay, and importantly, for the rest of the talk, actually, institutional entrepreneurs can act as either leaders or brokers. So we'll talk about these terms briefly. Okay, what are leaders? Simple definition. A leader is an agent with a following, period. Okay, easy definition, right? So what do? They see opportunity where others do not. They motivate, their motivation is, well, maybe they want power. Maybe they're motivated by ideology, certain problems they see, certain things that they feel should be done, sense of obligation. What do? They mobilize, they provide or withhold services and information. They define issues, they shape understandings, okay? They issue directives, they focus attention on themselves or maybe on certain sets of processes. They exercise power directly. They are, however, constrained by follower preferences, okay? And also by activity of competing leaders, all right? So in other words, leadership is a political process. Okay, a leader is going to emerge from interaction with followers. They do something, followers react, they do something else, so forth. Okay, brokers. Brokers operate behind the scenes. Okay, they exercise power, but they do so indirectly. Okay, so they're mediators, arrangers, facilitators who operate with at least some locality. They can be defined as network specialists who straddle multiple unknown systems, gatekeepers across social synapses or choke points. Interesting definition, I think. They're defined by boundaries, physical, economic, political, conceptual, that they may mediate. Okay, they may be community leaders, they may be mid-level politicians, they may be bureaucrats, they may be business people, they may be religious officials, so on and so forth. They can be any of these things. They tend to have a continuum of interests ranging from enabler on one end to parasite on another end, right? They influence how power is mobilized and how it is disrupted. They alter rules. Okay, again, that's institutional entrepreneurship. They negotiate, arrange, they finesse, interpret, transform, translate, distort, and modify. And they make margins legible to the center and vice versa. They may sort of regulate in some fashion or influence access to land, access to government positions, access to NGOs, to business opportunities, and so on and so forth. All right? Okay, so institutional entrepreneurs, leaders or brokers or both, where are they going to operate? They're going to two broad domains, okay? The first one I'll say is political economic. In other words, they're going to influence political economic institutions. What does that mean? Well, they want to alter exchange institutions. Maybe they adjust markets. Maybe they adjust understandings and enforcement of property rights, contracting, so on and so forth. Or on the political side, maybe they work on decision-making rules, processes, positions, rights. An example which I think gives an idea of the applicability, the broad applicability of this concept, is that rebels along the Congo-Uganda border have transformed economic and political institutions by negotiating protection for cross-border traders. In other words, they reorganized the entire regulatory framework, probably in a very informal fashion, in that particular region. Okay, well, that's institutional entrepreneurship. That's political, economic, institutional entrepreneurship. Okay, normative identity, which is going to be the focus of the rest of the talk, actually. Okay, this type of entrepreneurship deals in the social meaning of action and social categories and characteristics. It's going to deal with those social meanings, all right? So they're going to work on norms, symbols of moral acceptability, alter understanding of ethical prescriptions, using that as an instrument of power, by the way. They may modify or reinterpret social identities ascribed to individuals or groups. Social location may be related to race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and so forth, okay? So in terms of normative influence, they can influence either existing norms or the the development, evolution of norms, and the two may overlap somewhat. But anyway, so to think about this, first off, let's define norms. Norms are mutually understood behavioral prescriptions with ethical content. Okay, they need to be mutually understood. So in other words, they're shared mental models. Okay, do this, don't do that. Okay, because of that, they have a syntax. What Sue Crawford and Yellow called an institutional syntax. In other words, they make a statement, and you can analyze that statement in terms of syntax. And so what I'm going to do is summarize that briefly. And institutional entrepreneurs can manipulate elements of that syntax. So the first part of that syntax would concern two elements that they identify, which I call the scope of application, which has to do with attributes and conditions under which the norm applies. In other words, to whom does it apply, when, where, how? So let's take a simple norm: do not cut in line. Well, this doesn't apply to 3-year-olds. Okay, and moreover, it also doesn't apply in any situation where there is no line. Okay, so entrepreneurs can manipulate this. What's the intent of the norm? What to do, what not to do? Well, don't cut in line. What's the strength or the deontic? How strong, whoops, is the ethical, I touched the screen. How strong is the ethical prescription? There we go. In other words, how bad is violation? Is it just, you just get sort of a weird look, or is it, punishable in some sense, right? Okay, so they can influence, institutional entrepreneurs can influence how people interpret all of these things and the salience of all of these things, which ones are in the focus of attention. So for example, on don't cut in line, does that apply when your good friend joins you in line in front of other people? Is that called cutting or not? Maybe not, I don't know, okay? Okay, so this is all going to impact expected reactions of others, of course, including conformity pressure. Norms have lots of conformity pressure. And this element of internalization. To what degree do people internalize norms, which means they believe in the ethical prescription of the norm and therefore have some inclination to follow it themselves, even if others don't notice what they're doing. Okay, so the second big area is institutional entrepreneurs can influence the evolution of norms. Fairly straightforward. They may discredit existing norms. They can exploit fragilities in existing institutional arrangements this way, and often with quite big effect. So maybe as a leader, they publicly violate the norm. Maybe as a broker, they get somebody else to do it, or make it easy for somebody else to do it. Or they could introduce a new behavioral prescription, right? Maybe they try to demonstrate with their own action or with their own signaling, with their own narrative, or something like that. Or again, as a broker, they get somebody else to do that. So an example of normative entrepreneurship would be in South Sudan. Newer prophets have, quote, defined the moral boundaries of acceptable violence, thereby conferring and withdrawing legitimacy to political leaders. Okay, that's a pretty potent form of institutional entrepreneurship that has a great deal to do with what does the norm say, how do we interpret it, who does it apply to, and so on and so forth, right? So now this normative entrepreneurship that I'm talking about very much interacts with social identities of both individuals and groups. So we need to turn to that topic. Okay, so first off, what do we mean? And note I'm combining ideas from these authors. A person's social identity for individuals would be a person's concept of their self in relation to other people and in relations to groups that they affiliate with. Okay, and these identities are partially chosen and partially socially imposed or inherited, right? So an example, part of my identity, I would say, is as a college professor, right? Okay, partially chosen. I decided to go to graduate school. Partially socially imposed. I didn't define what a professor is. I didn't define what a professor is supposed to do. I didn't define any of that. That's all we could say socially constructed, right? Okay, so that component of even my somewhat chosen identity of professor responds to social construction. Okay. Again, this is a mental model, a shared mental model, right? There are notions of what these things are and how they're supposed to operate. So we've got categories and causality. Category, professor, causality, lecture to students, give exams, grade, all that sort of stuff, right? So what this does is it relates one characteristics and to various social categories and activities, as I just illustrated. And it relates very closely to norms that people have internalized. In other words, internalized norms shape concepts of identity because they shape understandings of what a certain person, like me, for example, should or should not do. That becomes part of my identity, at least for the ones I've internalized. Maybe not for the ones I haven't internalized, okay? But for the ones I've internalized, yes, that's a part. So we can think then of mental models, these shared mental models of identities, as an asset. It's a type of assets. It's really a type of human capital, if you want to use economic language, although a type that economists often don't consider very much. Produced from cultural history, produced from certain sets of characteristics and certain sets of social interactions, right? And what does it do? It helps us navigate the social environment. It reduces uncertainty. So for example, here, my role as a college professor makes it really easy for me to get what I'm supposed to be doing here, right? And there's some variation on it, right? But it's pretty straightforward, okay? Okay, we can think broadly speaking of types of social identity, and this can apply to either individuals or groups, and I'll get to group social identity in a minute. Okay, they can either be relational, which means they're based on specific personal relationships and specific network interactions, specific roles, engagements. And so workplace relations can often be very relational, right? I have a certain relationship, let's say, with my department chair. I have other relationships with my students. I have other relationship with the dean, so on and so forth. And these relationships at least inform my identity to some degree, right? So they're very person-specific, activity-specific, relationship-specific. On the other hand, social identities are also categorical, right? Social categories, which are basically socially constructed. Okay, I'm a male. I'm from the United States of America. I mean, you know, I didn't invent any of these social concepts, right? And those are categories, and my self-understanding is at least somewhat based on those categories, as well as other people's reaction to me, also somewhat based on those categories, right? So they can be group-based, impersonal, race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and socially constructed and often ascriptive, though they don't always have to be ascriptive. Occupation is probably not ascriptive. And I want to mention there's three key dynamics go here. They're really important to institutional entrepreneurship. Okay, the first is externalities, the second is affiliations with groups, and the third is resource conflict. So I'll go through these in order. Okay, so identity externalities. People prefer activity that affirms who they think they are. Okay, and so what does that mean? That means that actions taken by other people can either reinforce or threaten somebody's sense of identity. So an example would be that suppose a woman worker enters an all-male construction site, okay? Some of the men on that site may feel kind of uncomfortable with that, okay? Well, if so, that's an identity externality, okay? The woman's doing what she wants to do, and some of the guys don't like it, all right? So this can be a focus of within and between group comparison, okay? And it can be a type of interaction that can generate social cleavage and conflict, and identity externalities can often generate a zero-sum game. Well, you're not supposed to do something that I don't like. Well, that's going to restrict my benefits at your expense and vice versa, right? So we can often get zero-sum games that institutional entrepreneurs can play with when it comes to identity externalities. Okay, so yeah, fertile ground for identity politics. Okay, second big category, group affiliation. Okay, again, this is a key element of social identity. Which groups do I belong to? Am I a college professor? Am I something else? Again, partially chosen, partially imposed. The discretionary element of affiliation is going to respond to three things. I think this is from Shio, by the way. Put the citation there. A material factor, is affiliating with group X more beneficial materially than affiliating with group Y. So suppose I'm comparing college professor, high school teacher. Okay, professors usually you're paid more. So maybe that entered my calculation somewhere, all right? Cognitive factors, social distance between my perception of who I am and my perception of a prototypical member of that group. Well, maybe I feel I better fit in as a professor than a high school teacher. Actually, I think that's probably right. Okay, and then an affective factor, status. Does Group X have higher status than Group Y? Well, again, in many circles, the professor might have higher status, although there are no doubt some exceptions to that. But anyway, but this can all enter the discretionary element of group affiliation. And the thing is that this status thing is going to depend a great deal on distributions of political economic resources. And then that's going to get something. That's going to make things interesting. Okay, so identity entrepreneurs can then influence interpretations of every single one of these terms. They can bring forward the salience of one, reduce the salience of another as they want, to the extent that they can via their narratives, actions, and so on and so forth. Okay, so interest, social distance, status. And this is going to tend to lead to some resource conflict. But before we get there, I want to talk about group identities, group social identities. Okay, so group social identity. Okay, we can think of these as perceptions of group, and again, shared mental models, roughly shared perceptions of group characteristics and proclivities. And this is who this group of people are, and this is how we think they're going to act. Something like that, right? Okay. And they're in some vague sense, and no doubt very hard to model sense, the sum of affiliation concepts from individuals. Agent-based modeling might help with this, by the way. But anyway, and where the influence of any individual is going to be, mediated very much by distributions of power, and institutional entrepreneurs can have a lot to do with that. Maybe they've got some undue influence. Okay, so we can say there's a coevolution of individual and group identities, which we could call social construction, by the way. Individuals construct their identities from affiliation with groups, but the production of individual identities generates externalities that influence what goes on in the group, conceptions in the group, and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay. We can also say that these group social identities are a form of collective property that transforms characteristics of members or non-members into particular types of social relations. So, for example, we may have a notion of what, let's say, teenagers, how they are supposed to relate to adults. Okay, well, that would be something to do with group identities, right? And of course, they're going to generate or maybe not of course, but group identities, when they're strong at least, can generate group identity norms. In other words, a member of this group is supposed to do X, Y, Z. And clearly, if a college professor, there's things I'm supposed to do and a bunch of stuff I'm not supposed to do, right? Okay. And of course, institutional entrepreneurs can influence all that. Yeah, we can get into, and I'm taking a lot of time. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Stratification economics is really interesting, developed by William Darity and a bunch of colleagues. But anyway, they focus on groups' identities as sort of prompt for collective action and coalition formation. And they're arguing that people engage in a great deal of relative group comparison. Okay, and this might be by race, ethnicity, gender, caste, religion, political ideology, all kinds of stuff, right? That's not a complete list by any means. Sometimes we can think of, let's say, dominant groups, and let's just call other groups, okay? And both groups can have internal hierarchies. Individuals may locate themselves or compare themselves within each type of hierarchy, all right? Evaluate their position, and they may have concern for relative economic position, relative political power, which can underlie status in some fashion. And these can spawn things like in-group altruism. In other words, I'm willing to contribute to the benefit of my group because, among other things, it helps increase the status of my group. On the other hand, in-group altruism can often generate exclusivity and hostility to other groups. So all of this then is going to create and respond to resource conflict, which is my third element here. Okay. So resources, and we can think fairly broadly here, not just wealth and income, but also land. Land can be really important with identity, by the way. Point source resources like oil, gold, diamonds, political position, access to information, platforms to transmit information and ideas, so on and so forth. Those are all resources, and they can underlie status comparison. So again, from stratification economics, Davis says categorical identity is deeply embedded in intergroup inequality relationships. Okay, and then Darity says competition over material resources lies at the heart of persistent group affiliation and attachment. So again, there's something about if I want to affiliate with a group, it's got something to do with how that group competes for resources with other groups. Okay. Group altruism can generate conflict. An example from Kenya, within group altruism combined with between group antagonism creates material incentives for the reproduction of ethnic identity norms. Okay, pretty big statement. I'm not going to pronounce this last name very well. Gathurchi, something like that. Anyway, so I'll pause and recap, and then I got two more topics. Okay, so institutional entrepreneurs influence understandings of norms, their scope, their intent, their strength, and their evolution. Discredit old, bring in new. Social identities can be either relational or categorical. They reflect internalized norms. They operate with dynamics related to externality, group affiliation, resource conflict, and group comparison. And then group social identities are socially constructed interpretations of group membership and group members, and they often generate group norms. A member of this group is supposed to do X, Y, Z, and not something else. Okay. And moreover, conflict enhances categorical identity and the rigidity of group norms often. Okay. And so here's where Amartya Sen gives us some pretty interesting ideas about identity. Okay. He knows the two types of identity, which he argues everybody has. They're plural identities, and these are multiple, right? And they're primarily relational. In other words, the same person can identify with a religion, a political ideology, an ethnic group, a race, an occupation, a marital status, an age, a position in their family, group activities like sports, so on and so forth, right? So most of us arguably have a whole set of plural identities, and these different identity concepts interrelate with each other in some relational fashion, often, okay? And they're not exclusionary. It's okay to be more than one of these things, all right? On the other hand, singular identities focus on category only, and particularly on a ascriptive category, often that has something to do with inheritance or race or heritage or gender or something like that, right? And so singular identities just narrow down and focus on the social category, which of course is socially constructed. Okay, and institutional entrepreneurs can play a big role in both the construction, the social construction of those categories, and then the use of those categories to advance identity politics. Okay, and that's what I'm going to argue. So you're evaluating a person not on the basis of what they do, but on their race, their gender, their ethnicity, their religion, their ideology, whatever, right? And Sen says that these offer descriptive misrepresentations of the universe of plural and diverse classifications that shape the world in which we actually live. So for Sen, this is reality, but it can be focused in this direction, okay? He goes on and says that singular identities impose excessive demands, yielding a perceived absence of choice about our identities. In other words, if you're in group X, you really can't affiliate with people in group Y or interact with them. Okay, because if you do, then you're not really a member of group X. Okay. So what are these going to do? They're going to create stringent group norms, reinforce them, and enforce them. Okay. So impacts, okay, reduce salience of intergroup differences such as class within ethnic group. Okay. Foundation of group prejudice. Group A may sort of generally have a shared mental model, sort of, that they are superior to group B, that they have proprietary access to certain positions, resources, and so on and so forth. That group B is in some sense alien, and that they're suspicious of B's designs on A's prerogative. So it's not the same thing as an individual psychological propensity. It's a group shared mental model. Okay. And then restrictive group norms. A good loyal member must do this, that, and the other. Okay. So we can then say that individual and group identities are probably some mix of singular and plural. And being an economist, I had to write at least one equation. Sorry, okay. So we can say that the group identity then is in some sort of a weighted sum of two terms, where the E here means ascriptive ethnic, race, or other ascriptive category. Okay, and the Z stands for all relational interactions or relational categories. Okay, so it's a mix of these two things, and then we can say that the importance or the weight put on this categorical term is going to respond to social norms, to who adheres to social norms, to all kinds of socially defined categories, to various sorts of symbols, and to resource, very importantly, to resource conflict. Okay, so in particular, we can say that land, lootable resources, oil. If you can seize all the oil, you can do all kinds of stuff, right? Lootable resources, position, political position, status position, interact with important identity symbols, heritage. Okay, now we can have heritage stories, right, about the social identity of this group comes from a homeland. Okay, there can be a lot of identity categorization on the basis of land ownership. Okay, so anyway, territorial group identity, for example. So again, institutional entrepreneurs then can promote this singularity by pushing the salience of these kinds of categories, these kinds of relationships. And then what they're going to do is interpret and enforce identity norms. Again, promote singularity. And then we can say, well, identity, social cleavage, conflict, and identity politics. These things are all going to merge together now. So they're going to promote singularity, which may indicate a disjuncture between the social norms of group A and group B. Group A thinks what group B does is improper and vice versa. Okay. Social cleavage, conflict. We could say this is a nonlinear relationship. There can be a tipping point after which essentially conflict generates more singularity, which generates more conflict. Okay. Again, land, lootable resources, position, symbols all interact here. Entrepreneurial influence matters, and this is what I would argue is a foundation of identity politics. So these sorts of dynamics are the foundation of identity politics. And then moving on, I'm almost done. We can say identity politics then, what does it do? It uses categorical, usually descriptive group identities, all right, to motivate collective action, coalition formation, and importantly, action against others, okay, against rivals, creating rivalry, creating conflict, creating social cleavage, right? Focuses on category singularity, identity norms, minimize class differences within group, promote group prejudice, antagonism, mobilize a sense of entitlement and a sense of deprivation. So notice that even dominant groups may feel deprived because they're not really getting everything they think they're entitled to. So you can have both entitlement and deprivation reinforcing each other. Okay, and then of course threat from some other group to identity activity. Okay, well, who does this? Here's some famous examples, right? Putin, Modi, Erdogan, Orban, Trump, Farage, Le Pen. So, okay, not just politicians, right? These are charismatic leaders, by the way. Every single one of them, charismatic leader. Brokers, Rupert Murdoch, media broker, right? Arguably as powerful as a lot of these other folks. Tucker Carlson, media leader, maybe? Anyway, and then organizations, Heritage Foundation. A whole set of policy proposals based on what I would tend to call identity politics of white Christian nationalism. They might not like that description. I don't know. All right, another example, civil war in former Yugoslavia. Okay, Slobodan Milosevic, what did he do? He created a whole series of stories about Serbian heritage. All right, and threats from Bosnians, Croatians, and ethnic Albanians on 3 of their borders. All right. Good Serbs then are supposed to take action against these groups, not associate with them, and then down the road take action against them. Okay. Meanwhile, what's his first name? Tudjman. That starts with an F. Anyway, he does the same thing. He's Croatian, and he does exactly the same thing. These Serbs are terrible. They're threatening us, so on and so forth. Guess what? These guys reinforce each other. They operate, intentionally or not, in a symbiotic fashion. Each one increases the other one's claim to ethnic nationality. Okay, and similar reactions, mostly from Milosevic, happen with respect to Bosnia and Kosovo, and we end up with the Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslav Civil War of the 1990s. Okay, so that's that. So conclusion. Identity entrepreneurs generate identity politics by manipulating shared understandings of propriety conferred by social norms and related concepts of social identity. They promote and utilize identity singularity to sow social cleavages that enhance their positions by projecting fear of other. Okay. Now, on a less pessimistic note, at least conclude with that, right? Alternative institutional entrepreneurs can utilize the same principles, but just in the reverse direction, okay? To unravel identity singularity and identity politics, to build pluralistic coalitions and promote diverse, inclusive institutions. All right. Thank you. Yeah, Eric.
Well, first, thanks for that very, complete and rigorous description, I think, of the phenomenon. On this idea of identity singularity, so if we just take the American example with Trump, there's obviously amping up this kind of, white Christian identity, but there also seems to be a coalition of identities in there too. Gun owners,
Sure.
Some, class dimensions,
Yeah.
Midwest, regional identities.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Would you say that is, rather than sort of, that there's maybe one kind of dominant identity cutting across these, maybe the white Christian nationalism, white American and Christian, maybe, and then these are sort of sitting under that in kind of a coalition? Or are these also interest politics? Gun owners could be also seen as an interest group.
Well,
Just trying to sort of see how that fits into your.
I mean, I think the line between identity and interest politics is fuzzy in places. Let's put it that way. Singular maybe, if interpreted literally maybe, which I just invited, right? Maybe too restrictive a term. Walters, that's her first name, who wrote a book entitled How Civil Wars Start, talked about the notion of super factions, where essentially people who I would call identity entrepreneurs, I don't think she uses that term, combine certain types of identity, but with what I would call a singular focus on this combination to create super factions. So there can be a class element to it, there can be a religious element to it, there can be a racial or ethnic element to it. And that when you get all of these things pointing in the same direction, then you get what she would call a super faction. And that is likely to, at least in her book, those factions are what generate civil wars. But
and maybe just to follow on to that, is that pointing in the same direction, primarily pointing at the same enemy?
Yes, pointing at the same
less
enemy.
about pointing in, some agreed set of policies or positive action. But
right.
We can all agree, we hate the metropolitan liberal league.
Exactly. Yeah. Generally pointing at the same enemy. Yeah, good point. Yeah. And there may be some sort of vague policy, but nothing
Yeah.
Nothing specific enough to really,
maybe, you know, keep the immigrants out or whatever at that level.
Thanks so much. I'm wondering about examples about where an institutional entrepreneur maybe has created more cohesion in the society instead of kind of dividing, instead of producing
yeah,
polarization.
yeah, you can get that, right? I might say Nelson Mandela, when he, you know, essentially put an end to the apartheid regime in South Africa, certainly would have created some cohesion, which is absolutely under stress right now, but Nelson Mandela is no longer alive. So yeah, there can be institutional entrepreneurs who definitely push in the second direction on the slide, who push in good directions. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and you know, many smaller figures who we've never heard of. And you know, we can think of people, you know, plenty of people in other nations if, you know, sort of generate enough little bit of research, a little bit of memory can identify many. In other words, so it would be using the same principle, but focusing on pluralistic identities, creating bridges across social categories, and also sort of trying to promote norms of, I don't know, cooperation, inclusiveness, you know, all that good stuff, right? And there certainly can be entrepreneurs who work in that direction, and then of course, but you can get manipulation of that direction too, right? You can say people who are working for cooperation, who are really working for themselves and all that kind of stuff. So it gets complicated.
Yes, also, sorry, a follow on to that, and Maya Tudor's work on, you know, positive nationalism,
Yeah,
you know, would fit into that.
would fit into that, yeah,
That, you know, you can use a nationalist narrative to knit together,
right,
and create commonality across disparate groups that,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
different classes, castes or regions, you know, that we all have a common interest as a national identity.
yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, thanks. That was very interesting. Just an observation. Your list of the exponents of identity politics were quite sort of generally right-wing.
Yeah,
And interestingly, a lot of those figures, like Nigel Farage, would rail against identity politics in their rhetoric. They'd see identity politics as sort of an enemy movement.
Yeah.
Is that an example of this sort of symbiotic relationship between?
yeah, I think it is.
Two
I think it is. And identity politics is not the sole domain of the right. You know, I would argue probably Mao Zedong arguably used a lot of it. Stalin may have used a lot of it. You know, so it's not, and you know, there can be certainly figures on the left in many contexts who would use it as well. So it's not, you know, the key examples, the really prominent examples right now tend to come from the right, but that doesn't mean it's exclusively the property of the right by any means. Yeah, and to some degree, I think that in the United States anyway, there was a lot of identity politics, maybe not in extreme form, but certainly identity related politics, developed in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, when civil rights morphed into Black power, feminism, you know, and it's not necessarily all bad, but there is an identity-based element associated with some of this. And then I think one misconception that some of the let's say activists in the late 60s and 1970s had was that this sort of identity stuff would only operate on the left to get rid of traditional types of oppression, you know, patriarchy and so forth, and without the realization that exactly the same principles that can be used on the other side. And yeah, and they will reinforce each other to some degree, and it's really a very delicate dance. You know, how do you navigate this stuff, right? You know, the George Floyd murder. You know, there was a lot of interaction on both sides. Certainly some identity, and this is exactly the point. The conflict pushes people towards categorical identities, right? That's just what happens, you know, good, bad, indifferent, whatever, that happens. And then there's gonna be reactions to that. You know, so one of the unintended, I think, consequences of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is he created Ukrainian nationalism, which barely existed before the invasion. Okay. No, not Russian. Whereas before, it might not have been a big deal. At least before Crimea. And it's not, I don't really mean to say that all of this has to be bad. I mean, I think there is some role for affirming identity, particularly for traditionally oppressed groups. And then the question is, how can that be navigated in a way that, you know, doesn't induce too big a reaction on the other side, doesn't become too extreme in and of itself, and sort of permits a road to something better and something different at some point in time. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not sure that the tradition around Darity would see identity politics in the US as being something that started in the 60s, right? Like,
Oh, no, it didn't start in the 60s at all. No, it probably started before the Republic started, but anyway.
And yeah, but the one way to I guess frame the question you're asking maybe is, you know, as a big Sen fan as well, right? Under what conditions do the singular and exclusive identities outcompete the more complicated plural identities, and under what conditions is it the other way, right? And
Yeah,
I can't imagine that the binding constraint on either of those changes is there isn't an entrepreneur somewhere in the wings waiting to try it.
sure.
It's,
Sure.
you know, it's gonna be, if you assume that there's always somebody trying to try, you know, to move in both directions. Well, who's winning when, and what are the structural characteristics of a place where that's more likely to succeed, right?
Yeah, definitely. I guess the key statement here would be resource conflict is going to tend to promote singularity. Okay, and you know, certainly we can see that, you know, I mean, almost any war generates a type of identity singularity on both sides.
I'd say Winston Churchill was an identity entrepreneur.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, Winston Churchill was an identity entrepreneur, and arguably, at least during the war, did some good things when you consider what the alternative was, right? So yeah, so it's not always a bad thing. There, you know, I haven't, with some of the other things I've done, I've thought more about, okay, what testable hypothesis do you get out of this? I haven't taken this to that extent very much, except to say a little bit about, go back. We can get some hypotheses out of these, and in other papers, I've actually generated some hypotheses out of these. In other words, unequal distribution of land, unequal access to rootable resources. These things can tend to promote identity conflict. Okay, you know, group A, particularly in a situation where suppose group A and group B are neighbors in a developing country, two regions of a developing country. Group B occupies land that has a resource that group A thinks it's really entitled to. Then you're gonna get some messy identity politics, I think, around that. You'll get social cleavages, identity politics, and maybe it'll explode into conflict, maybe it won't. Right. So yeah. So I think we could make some hypotheses about terms of these, maybe specified a little more clearly. And argue that we could, if we had some measurement of singularity and some measurement of some of these terms, we could then test a hypothesis that says increases in these terms should generate more singularity. So. Yeah, back.
So I walked in a few minutes late, so I missed a crucial bit of framing. So apologies if this is something you addressed already, but I felt like in the talk, you kind of shifted between institutional entrepreneur and identity entrepreneur as almost kind of synonyms. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between the
Yeah, I may have slipped the language. The term I mean to use is institutional entrepreneurs, and they operate in all of these domains. In other words, they may exhibit political economic entrepreneurship, they may exhibit normative entrepreneurship, they may exhibit identity entrepreneurship, where normative and identity are very close together anyway. It's quite possible that I said identity entrepreneur when I meant institutional entrepreneur.
with identity entrepreneur being kind of subset of.
Yeah, that would be a subset. And I didn't want to use, I wanted to leave the subset to entrepreneurship rather than entrepreneur, because the same person could engage in quite a few of these things simultaneously or in sequence. Whereas the entrepreneurship would be, okay, this is the area that we're actually operating and are focusing on for the most part. So yeah, I may have said identity entrepreneur when I meant institutional. And of course, they got the same letter I, so there we go.
I guess I found myself wondering as I was trying to think about how I would think of the distinction, whether, when I think about institutional entrepreneurship, I think about someone who is kind of trying to change the rules of the game. Whereas when I think about identity entrepreneur, I think of someone who's trying to change the players and how the players think of themselves, and that's how they play the game. And I wonder, like I'm not persuaded myself that that's a sensible distinction, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, that you're right, that identity entrepreneurship is, but I think what it's trying to do is influence the understanding of social categories. And I would still argue that understanding of social categories is a mechanism through which you can achieve institutional change. And that would be the focus of identity politics. So the identity entrepreneurship is to some degree, we could think of it kind of as a means to an end. A means to the end of institutional entrepreneurship. Maybe you can have some specialization, division of labor, that stuff going on in here. Yeah, anyway, yeah, but I think that's right. Identity entrepreneurship is, I want to focus on its influence on social categories. But obviously, social categories, since those social categories are part of individual identities, it's definitely going to influence individual behavior, for sure.